Hey, do you feel like the culture is moving further and further away from the values that you kind of hold dear? Do you feel like the culture is becoming actually more hostile to your faith? Do you feel like unless something changes, that at some point in the future, there's a strong possibility that you're going to be forced to bow down to the culture? Well, today, we're going to look at how even though we sometimes feel like we are captive in a culture that goes against godliness, we can stand tall in our faith. Now, our culture used to honor the things that honored God, but not anymore. Our country is becoming what's called a post-Christian culture. Real pressure is beginning to be placed on Christ followers to affirm the things that culture says are right, but the Bible clearly says are wrong. This plays out in lots of ways. The culture says that we can't define what is right or wrong, and that we all get to live our own personal truth, unless, of course, that truth is Jesus is the truth, the way, and the life. And culture is telling us that we should try to pursue anything that makes us happy. And again, unless, of course, following Jesus is what makes you happy. What's really concerning is that our government is becoming less and less concerned with our personal liberty and more concerned with making sure that we bow down to the culture. And I know from personal experience that honestly, there's nothing more frightening than trying to align yourself against an all-powerful government. And I'd love to tell you about a time I had an encounter with the Secret Service. Okay? Those of you know, I started my college career at the University of Georgia, but before graduating, I actually moved to Portland, Oregon, so that I could start a church in a part of Portland that didn't have any churches. And while I did that, I basically kind of kept whittling away at my degree. Well, it took me 11 years to get my college degree. I was on the 11-year plan. It was awesome. But here's the deal. I mean, I moved to Portland. I was going to college part-time, while full-time I was starting a church, getting married, and having 2 kids. And so, yeah, it took me 11 years, but when I got the degree, it was a momentous occasion for the Pressley family. I mean, it really was. In fact, it was such a momentous occasion that then President Bill Clinton decided to come and speak at my graduation ceremony. Now, he didn't come because of me, okay? He just had some policy that he wanted to plug, and he picked Portland State's graduation, and it just so happened that the time I graduated, the President of the United States was the commencement address speaker. And I got to be honest with you, look, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or anywhere in between, it's pretty cool when the president speaks at your graduation ceremony. And it was an awesome day. But I remember, man, we had to get there really early, hours and hours and hours before the ceremony began, because when the president shows up, there's a lot of security checkpoints that you have to go through. And I remember, you know how some college students like to decorate their cap? Well, I had this grand idea. I thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I brought a Portland State baseball cap and kept it with me? And then after I, go across the stage, shake hands with the president, get my, not the president, but the president of the university, get my degree, get that picture that I worked 11 years for, with the traditional cap. Then when I get to my seat, I can take the tassel off the traditional cap and put it on my baseball cap. That way, at the end of the ceremony, when you throw the cap up in the air, I could just forget about it. And let's be honest, a baseball hat's way cooler, right? That was my plan. But I get there, and I'm having to wait hours and hours and hours, and I'm having to hold this hat. And I was getting tired of holding the hat. So, of course, I'm brilliant. I come up with a great idea. I unzip my gown, I unclasp the back of the hat, and I attach it to the side of my belt loop. Don't have to hold my hat. So here's the deal. We begin, the entrance. Like I said, there's several checkpoints, and at every checkpoint, the Secret Service is there. The really big guys in black suits with earpieces who are very serious. Very serious. And I remember as we went through each checkpoint, we were pumped and excited about graduating, but every time we got to one of those checkpoints, we were like, okay, we're going to be nice and straight-laced and, very serious. Well, we got to the very last security checkpoint. And we were about to go out onto the arena floor, and I, zipped up my gown over the hat. And as I stepped through the last metal detector, what I'm about to describe to you took place in less than 3 seconds. As I step out, a really large hand grabs me on my right shoulder and pulls me out of line. Another large hand grabs me on the left shoulder and left arm and holds me in place. In an instant, there are 3 really large guys in black suits in my face. The one in the middle unzips my gown. The 2 on the outside open my gown. The one in the middle says, "It's a baseball hat, clear." They zip my gown back up and they put me back in line. And I almost peed myself. It was so scary. I was completely powerless. I learned 3 very important things that day. The first is never wear anything that can cause a suspicious lump at a secret at a checkpoint. Number 2, there are things in life that are infinitely more powerful than me. And number 3, and this is probably the most important thing, it is extremely scary and difficult to stand in opposition to those powerful things. And you know what? That's what it can feel like for Christ followers who want to stand tall in their faith in a culture that wants you to bow down. So, in this series, we're going to look at the lives of 4 young men in the Bible who found themselves in captivity in a culture that was completely against their faith. They also had to stand against a powerful government that wanted them to bow to their culture. And for them, standing tall was difficult, it was dangerous, and even potentially deadly. And we're going to learn from their example, and we're going to discover how we can honor God with our lives today as we stand tall for Him. Now, before we get into the first chapter of the book of Daniel, that's where we're going to be all 4 weeks of this series. We're going to be looking at what takes place in the life of Daniel and some of his friends. I want you to understand some of the background that's happening that sets up what we're going to look at. First of all, the events that take place happened in 587 BC. See, for generations and generations, the people of Israel have not been following God. They haven't been following God's laws, and in fact, they've even started to worship false gods in the temple. And so God allows the Babylonian Empire to overrun and destroy their country. Now, when that happened, they destroyed the temple and they destroyed the city walls. And they captured a large percentage of the population and carried them back to Babylon as slaves. And they were in Babylon for 70 years before they were allowed to return to their homes in Israel. Now, 4 of them were selected to be a part of the king's training program. One of the things that the king did is he selected the brightest among the people that he conquered, and he would put them in this training program where they would learn Babylonian culture, and once they had graduated from that program, they would become advisors and servants to the king. Well, 4 of the best and brightest was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, that was their Hebrew names. But when they were taken captive, they were given Babylonian names. Daniel was named Belteshazzar. The others became Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, some of you may know them as Rack, Sack, and Benny. Veggie tales, veggie tales, veggie tales, veggie tales. If you know, you know. So listen, from here on though, we're gonna refer to them as what they're most commonly known as, which is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And here's the deal. When they were carried into captivity, they were determined that they were going to stand tall for God. And that's why we're going to look at their lives. And here's the deal. Right off the bat, they were tested and their faith was put to the test. Here's the deal. King Nebuchadnezzar decreed that all of the young men in this program had to eat from the king's table and from his food. But here's the deal. The food that came from the king's table, much of the food was food that was listed in the Old Testament dietary restrictions from God as unclean food. The other deal was most of the meat that was being served to them was meat that was sacrificed to the Babylonian gods and was also unclean. And so here's the decision that Daniel, Shadrach, and Abednego had. They were either going to bow down to the Babylonian culture, to the powerful force of the Babylonian government, and sin against God, or they were going to stand tall for God and not bow down. But in standing tall, they run the risk of making the king mad. Let's see what they did in Daniel 1, verses 8 and 9. But Daniel resolved. I want you to circle the word resolved. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission. I want you to underline, asked the chief official for permission. Not to defile himself this way. Now, God had caused, underline that, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Okay, what happens next is pretty remarkable. So Daniel doesn't want to sin against God, but he doesn't want to upset the king. So he goes to the official who's in charge of their program, and he says, hey, can me and my friends, can we eat our own diet? And what happens is that the chief official replies to him. He says, hey, Daniel, I don't know if you know the king real well, but when people don't do what he says to do, they die. And here's the deal. If you don't eat the diet that everybody else is eating, if you guys are unhealthy and you begin to look sickly, the king is going to notice that and he's going to kill me. I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? So Daniel comes up with this. He says to him, well, hey, I've got an idea. How about we do a 10-day trial? You let everybody else eat the diet from the king's table, but me and my friends, let us eat our own diet. And at the end of 10 days, if we're sick, well, we'll just cross that bridge when we get to it. But if we're not, then let us eat our diet. The official agrees. And so Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't bow down. They were able to stand tall for God. So the question that we have to answer is this. How do you stand tall for God and not bow down to powerful forces? How do you stand tall for God and not bow down to powerful forces? There's three things that we're going to look at today that help us to stand tall in a godless culture. And the first one is your first fill-in. Here it is. Be resolved. Be resolved. In verse 8, we circled resolved. Daniel was resolved not to defile himself. Now, the Hebrew word for resolve means set upon his heart. In other words, Daniel had this inner resolve that he would not sin against God regardless of what it cost him personally. See, Daniel had settled the issue. He put his faith in God, and he would live a godly life even if it cost him. Now, I want you to consider this. Daniel did this before he entered the program of the king. But after he had witnessed the Babylonian army invade his country, ransack, murder, and destroy. So in the midst of all that trauma, in the midst of being taken captive and being taken to a foreign country, his response was to turn to God and resolve in his heart that he was going to live for God no matter what. Daniel had settled the issue. Before he was ever put in a position to have to make a stand, Daniel knew that he would stand. So let me ask you this. If you want to stand tall, have you made that resolve in your life? Have you resolved to live for God no matter what the cost? Here's the deal. If you're here today and you're not a Christ follower, resolve for you is to make the decision to become a Christ follower. Because here's the deal. If you're not a Christ follower, you are separated from having a relationship with God because of your sin and rebellion against Him. And the reality is that if you were to die separated from God, you were going to spend eternity in a very real place, a very awful place called hell that is completely separated from anything good and anything to do with God. But God loved you so much that He didn't want that to happen. So He sent His Son, Jesus, to live a perfect life here on earth and to die a death that was the perfect sacrifice for all of our sin. So here's the deal. If you believe that Jesus died on the cross for your sin, and if you ask God to forgive you, and if you make a commitment and resolve to let Him lead and guide your life, the truth is you're going to be restored in your relationship with God, and you're going to be able to spend eternity with Him in heaven. And here's the deal. You do that by praying a prayer of faith, where you basically tell Him that you believe Jesus died for you. You ask Him to forgive you, and you make a commitment and resolve to live for Him. Now, there's a sample prayer of faith that you can pray. It's printed in your message notes. I would love for you to pray that prayer. You can pray it right now if you want to, but at the end of the message, there's going to be a time where I give you an opportunity to do that. Just want to let you know it's coming. Now, for all of us who are Christ followers, resolve is not a New Year's resolution, okay? Resolve is to live completely for Jesus no matter what it costs you. So rather than invest in this new year in frivolous resolutions, like that gym membership you're paying for an entire year, but you're really going to go a couple times over the next couple weeks, right? Instead of doing that, why don't you begin to invest in things that are going to help you grow in your relationship with God? This is something that I'm doing this year. I ordered this, it's the 1-year chronological study Bible. You know, you've heard of the 1-year Bible. They break it down into chunks. You read a chunk a day, and throughout the year, you're going to read the entire Bible. That's what this is, but here's the other kind of catch. It's laid out chronologically. You know, when you read the Bible, the Bible isn't a book, it's a library. And they have different sections of the library, but in this, it's like a story that unfolds chronologically. And honestly, I can't wait to get this started tomorrow. It's going to be awesome. But here's the deal. What can you do to invest in your relationship with God that's going to grow your resolve? Here's an idea for you, and it's your next fill-in. Go to the Mount every week. Go to the Mount every week. Now, some of you are going, Heath, I would love to go to Colorado every week. That would be fantastic, especially in the summer, right? I know. Here's the deal. I'm not talking about the actual mountains. What I'm talking about is go to the Sermon on the Mount every week. Over the last several months, at various points, we've been encouraging you to develop a daily time with God. Find a place that is kind of quiet, that you can go to consistently, where you can bring your Bible and where you can read your Bible and where you can pray, right? Find your place and spend your time doing that. I want to encourage you, while you're doing that, once a week, read the Sermon on the Mount that's found in Matthew chapter 5 and 6. Because here's the deal. The Sermon on the Mount is the sermon that Jesus gave where he lays out who he is, what he's about, and how you can be like him. And if you want to grow in your resolve to live in godliness, every week you need to be digging into the sermon that really tells you how to do that. Let me continue. How can you stand tall for God and not bow down to culture? Well, here's your next fill-in. Be respectful. Be respectful. In verse 8, we underlined, ask the chief official for permission. When Daniel was faced with either bowing down to the king or standing tall for God, he stood tall respectfully. Again, realize this is an incredibly powerful force that's trying to make him bow down to that culture. But he doesn't bow down. He stands tall. But he stands tall in a way that you would not expect him to. Now, before we talk about what he did, I think we need to understand what he didn't do. He didn't throw a fit and he didn't pick a fight. Think about this. When he was called to make a stand for his faith, he didn't throw a fit and he didn't pick a fight. He didn't create any unnecessary showdown with the officials. He didn't act like a jerk and demand his own way. I'm a child of God and I need to eat God's food and I'm not going to eat the king's food, and if you make me eat the king's food, then God is going to smite you. I don't even know if that's a word. But Daniel didn't do any of that, and we shouldn't either. Instead, Daniel was humble. He was polite. He was respectful. He wasn't rebellious. He just respectfully asked for permission not to eat the king's food and to eat his own diet. Why did he do that? I think he did it because he had spent time focusing on his relationship with God. And because he was doing that, he was becoming godly. And because he was godly, he actually responded in a really Christ-like way. Think about this. When Jesus was arrested and was about to be crucified, he was brought before the Roman leaders of the day, and he had some interaction with them. And in those interactions, guess what? Jesus was polite and respectful, even to the men who were going to send him to his death. And that's what Daniel did. He was polite. He showed respect. He acted Christ-like. Now here's the deal. If you want to stand tall for Jesus in our godless culture, you need to be less demanding and more respectful. You need to be more Christ-like. Hey, remember that whole go to the mount thing? Again, the Sermon on the Mount is the one place where you get where Jesus says this is how you be Christ-like. That's why you need to go to it every week. Now here's what happens when you make your stand by being respectful. And it's your next fill-in. God gives you more, but he gets the glory. God gives you more, but he gets the glory. Okay, in verse 9 we underline God had caused. Because Daniel was resolved and respectful, God caused Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to grow in knowledge and wisdom. And then God caused the chief official to give them favor. Look, Jesus went to the chief official and he said, hey, can I have permission to do this? And because Daniel did that in a Christ-like way, God opened up the heart of this official to be willing to play ball with him. They did the trial run. At the end of the trial run, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were actually healthier than all the others. And so he said, yeah, eat your dill, man. You do you. You guys look great. And now let's look what happened as they began to flourish. And the entire time that they were in this training program, they flourished. And God actually gave them even more ability than what they had when they began. Let's look what happens in verses 18 through 20. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to. I want you to underline none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them. He found them 10 times better. Underline that. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. I love this. As they're in this program, eating the diet that they wanted to eat, having been respectful, having been resolved, God makes them flourish. He gives them gifts and abilities beyond their capabilities. And when they get to the end and they're questioned by the king, King Nebuchadnezzar doesn't find anyone equal to them. In fact, they're 10 times smarter. They're 10 times wiser. And as a result, guess what he does? He gives them positions of influence within his government. And they become advisors to the king. Think about this. Think about this. God gave them more, but he got the glory for it. Because he put them in a position to influence a king and actually begin to change Babylonian culture. I love it. Here's the deal. When you resolve to stand tall in your faith, when you resolve to do that in a respectful and Christ-like way, God is going to give you more than you need to do the things he wants you to do. And he's going to put you in positions to have influence, to be able to help others come to faith. And when you begin to do that, and people's lives begin to change, that's how cultures change, one life at a time. Listen, God isn't going to change our culture because we throw fits and we demand it. He's only going to change our nation through the human heart. And the human heart changes when it comes into contact with Christ-likeness. So, will you resolve to stand tall for God? Will you spend time with God, grow in your Christ-likeness? Will you be respectful whenever you find that you have to take a stand? Will you trust that God will give you his favor and put you in a place of being able to make a difference for him? If you will, then you're going to stand tall for God and make a difference for him. Let me close everybody in prayer. And hey, if you want to become a Christ follower today, right now's the time to pray that sample prayer that's printed in your message notes. If you're watching online, it's going to pop up on the screen. But this is your opportunity to become a Christ follower. Everybody else, let's close in prayer together. Father, I love you, and I just thank you so much for the opportunity that we have to take a look at the lives of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God, if there was ever anybody that understands what it's like to try to live a godly life in a culture that isn't godly, it's them. And Father, as we continue this series, we're going to see how you really did allow them to change a culture because they were willing to stand tall. But my prayer for us today, God, is that we would resolve that you are going to be the most important thing in our life and that we're going to live for you regardless of what the cost is. But also, God, I pray that we would begin to do the things that we need to do to become more Christ-like. So that as we do that and have an opportunity to stand, we would do so in a manner that brings honor to you. And we would do so in a way that you use to change people's hearts. And we do ask that revival would break out and that this culture would be transformed through your Son. We love you, God. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.